by the mountainside in a wild and lonely spot. No dwelling there for 3 miles round except her father's cot. And still on many a wintry night young folks would gather there, for her father kept a social board and she was young and fair.
It's nearly Christmas, and therefore, as we've discovered previously, the perfect time for ghost stories. I'm not generally one for reading scary novels. Short ghost stories, sure, why not? Usually more weird than scary. But a full-length book meant to frighten as well as entertain, not usually my thing. But this duology by Alex Bell has been staring at me from across the library for months now, so I gave in and read it. Frozen Charlotte and Charlotte Says are a 2-part series set in the Isle of Skye in Scotland and follows strange events surrounding an old schoolhouse and a collection of Frozen Charlotte dolls. The first book, Frozen Charlotte, is about Sophie, who travels to visit her cousins in the Isle of Skye. They, of course, live in the old schoolhouse, where before the book begins they find a collection of creepy dolls in the cellar. But strange things have been happening. Tiny cold hands touching her in the night, whispers from empty rooms, and sounds from that one room that no one goes in. Sounds from her cousin Rebecca's room. Her dead cousin Rebecca. Charlotte Says, however, is technically a prequel, but really they can be read in whatever order you like. I suppose I would recommend reading it in this order, with Frozen Charlotte and then Charlotte Says, but it doesn't really matter. Charlotte Says is set when the old schoolhouse was in use as a schoolhouse, and delves into the origin of the Frozen Charlotte dolls. Before we look at them, I'd like to add that Frozen Charlotte dolls are real things. They are briefly described in the books, and I wasn't sure if they were legit or just something Alex Bell had made up to be creepy dolls. But no, they are real. So Frozen Charlotte dolls are these like tiny porcelain figures ranging from teeny tiny to fair sized. They are stark naked and vaguely dead looking. They do seem to have an origin in a folk song referenced throughout the Frozen Charlotte books called Fair Charlotte, an American ditty about a vain young woman who doesn't put her cloak on when going to a ball, and by the time she arrives she has frozen to death. So that's cheerful. And as you may have guessed, these books have confirmed my suspicions that dolls are evil and should be destroyed before they can destroy you. And also that the Victorians were weird. Both of these books are pretty spooky, which I imagine was the author's intention, so big tick there. I liked the stories very much. I liked the sense of confinement, as the action is limited mostly to this house, harkening back to those 19th century Gothic novels. I also think the Isle of Skye is a fabulous place to set these books, as it adds to that sense of isolation. But also you get that bleak landscape, the cold and the wind and the sea. And Scotland, of course, is a hive of folklore and ghost stories, so it definitely adds to the paranormal feel. I enjoyed the mix of ghosts, demons and sort of twisted psyches present throughout both novels. It all meshed together to create a nicely textured story, so enjoyed that aspect. I also really loved the use of pre-existing props. So this is mainly the Frozen Charlotte dolls and of course the folk song to anchor the story in reality. And I think it's really important that these stories do that because it allows the reader to see the story in the wider world, which in turn deepens that sense of isolation, which is key to the atmosphere. The mystery of the dolls was done quite well across both books, with the focus being different enough that neither book felt like a rehash of the other. Frozen Charlotte explores what happened in the house because of the dolls, whereas Charlotte Says looks at the origin of the dolls themselves. And I think that's maybe why I would recommend reading them in that order. Because of how refreshing it was to have this sort of story that didn't feel the need to explain too much. I think over-explaining can be very detrimental to scary media as the atmosphere can get lost. So the fact that the first book had the confidence to just not go into it and leave the explanation and history as dolls were there because it was an old schoolhouse, and leaving it to the second book to delve deeper into the past of the dolls was a good shout. And in Charlotte Says, the mystery of the dolls is all tied up with the main character and her plotline, so it still fits. The story doesn't have to stop for exposition because the story is the exposition in a way. And finally, this book gave us the Ouija board app, which, I mean, it was kind of stupid, but I felt it deserves a nod just for the sheer, I don't know, audacity to have a Ouija board phone app. There were some odd writing choices. So in scary media, we have two sorts of encounters: active encounters and passive encounters. Active encounters are where the character is aware that something weird is happening in that moment and feels some level of immediate threat or danger. This is where they see the phantom, or feel the demon grabbing their ankle, or hear the rocking chair creaking down the hall. The ghost is there at that moment, whereas a passive encounter is more where a character becomes aware that something weird has happened, but they aren't in immediate danger. So this is where they see like the familiar face in an old photograph that can't possibly be there, or they come downstairs to find all their possessions have been rearranged in the night. Something has happened, but it's not happening right now. And they occur more often in your psychological leaning spooky stories because they allow one to play around with the idea of memory and unreliable narrators, whereas your active encounters are you get in your proper horrors. There is a mix of active and passive encounters in this, perhaps erring more on the side of active, but a lot of the active encounters are written quite passively. They were almost glossed over or put at the end of a chapter to then be picked up at the beginning of the next chapter, creating these unnecessary pauses. And I think I see what the author is trying to do, to put in these pauses at high tension moments to create anticipation, which is fine for a thriller because you're worried about the character, but in a ghost story it actually does the opposite because it takes you out of the moment. Creating a sense of fear relies on drawing the reader in and keeping them in the head of the character, not by taking them out and reminding them that they're reading a piece of fiction. I also suppose that the characters were a little bit lackluster. Both books have a fairly typical set of players, the young creepy girl or girls, the brooding young man, the preppy pretty girl, the kind handsome artist, the harsh schoolmistress. And this wasn't a huge problem for me because I'm a wimp, so the scary story was enough to keep me engaged. But I can see why some people with stronger hearts might be a little bit disappointed by the cookie cutter characters. In conclusion, yeah, I thought they were pretty good. I mean, they scared me. Not to the point of not sleeping, but that's because I would never allow a creepy doll into my house, let alone like a bajillion of them. But it spooked me enough to stick in my mind for a while afterwards. I would recommend these to people with an interest in scary media. Perhaps it's not spicy enough for veterans of the genre, but it might be worth a go, as they don't take very long to read. But I do think they're especially good for people who like the idea of spooky, scary stories, but are too wimpy to like watch those sorts of films. There's something gentler about a book. It's easier on the nerves. And as I said before, it doesn't matter which order you read them in because they don't spoil each other. I suppose it makes a little bit more sense to read them in the order they were written, so Frozen, Charlotte, and then Charlotte Says. But if you are more on the side of wimp, maybe switch them because Charlotte Says does end on a more horrifying note. So that's all for this video. I'm pretty sure this is the last one that goes out for Christmas, book review wise. So Merry Christmas. Sleep well, children.